What's changed in the world since you were a kid? Captain Prolapse said. I got my first porn mag from a car full of what I'm guessing were high school senior girls. I can't tell you how old they were exactly. I know they were in a seafoam Sebring convertible. The driver yelled, "Hey, check this out," as she slowed down and threw a tattered Penthouse magazine at me. Then the two in the back flashed me. I was never so happy that I walked my dog as I was that day. It all happened so fast, yet I'll never forget a single moment of those 5 seconds. I'm taking all of it to the grave. I used that memory and that magazine to absolutely destroy my teenage dick for years. Minute 27 said. Me and my buddy kept ours in a plastic bag in the woods. But not deep. His street dead ended at the woods and there was a drop-off. You could actually reach up under the street, so we kept it there. Years later I went back and reached up and felt the bag. I was super excited that I was gonna find my early 90s stash. At some point a hole was formed and it all got wet. Nothing left but a pile of pulp. Minphysis said. In the 90s the other F word was about the most common insult you'd hear among kids. Even kids from liberal families. Before '99, schools didn't practice lockdown drills. My first flights had virtually no security measures in place. Tacnicidal said. We were goofing off with fireworks on Sunday, and to freak the kids out a bit I took the sticks off of a few bottle rockets and set them off. Then me and a couple of other adults were talking about how when we were kids they were called NR chasers and you didn't even think of it being a racist term. It's just what the grown-ups called them, and so that's what they were. I think by junior high or so we had figured it out and stopped calling them that. Brainus on Fire said. At the risk of sounding positively geriatric, kids these days have no idea how hard we worked in the 70s and 80s to get our parents and grandparents to stop using that language. I don't care if it's not referring to a person, just call them Brazil nuts. I don't care if great-grandma is 92 years old, you do not drop that word in church, FFS. No, it is not enrigging. Every TV show you can think of during that time had some sort of very special episode involving a black character and the N-word, and how harmful and painful it was. And that's before we mention all of the other racial slurs and nasty, ridiculing language that was so prevalent. We didn't have Little Vietnam or Chinatown, we had GVO and CH-Town, and our generation pushed back hard for respectful language instead. Then Clinton got elected, and conservatives started whining about political correctness, and here we are today. Universe MMT said. When I saw the stats about the decrease of insects population, I didn't have a hard time believing it. As a kid at my parents' place, I hardly could go outside in the evening without being covered in bug bites and seeing them fly almost in dark clouds all around me. Now if I see 5 or 6 in the whole evening I'm impressed. And my parents' place didn't change, there was no new constructions or anything around, they lived near the woods. Yes, Hornberger said. I'd also say the ability to keep your life private independent of what you may choose to put out there. Like I just started a new job and in the orientation training video they mentioned that the company has a credit monitor on every employee, so if you get into debt they can flag you as being vulnerable to bribery to release trade secrets. Or the employers who require you to carry a company-issued cell phone at all times, so they can track your location 24/7. Or having to submit to pre-employment drug testing for jobs that don't involve safety or working with vulnerable populations. Like I shouldn't have to send my personal medical records to my employer to justify taking prescription medications that flag as dirty just to work in an office. But apparently being employed in modern America means ceding your right to keep your location, spending habits, and medical history private from the org cutting your paycheck. Counterhit said. Unless you have something in your job that makes you be on call, they don't really. But they do require that you accept a company-issued phone, and that during your workday you have to have it on and with you. Since you have to use the company phone a lot anyway, and since it is free because the company will pay for it, most people will just use that as their cell phone all the time and not carry 2 phones or switch after work. So even though the company doesn't explicitly require you to keep the cell phone on your person at all times, it just sort of works out that way by default most of the time. Cumbox Mold said. We had a whole unit in class that taught us this whole process. Researching skills. How to use the card catalog to look for relevant books, finding the article in the encyclopedia, etc. We had to pick a subject at random, from a fishbowl I think, and that is what we had to research to practice those skills. This was in late 1996. Very soon after that, I got my first home computer, and a few months later got Encarta 98. Whatever the fanciest version was, that also had additional apps such as a dictionary, thesaurus, quotations, etc. Not very long after that, we got internet access at home. I had it at home before we had it in school, but not before it was available at the local public library. We used to know what we were looking up, do it quickly, and then let the next person use the computer because there was a line. We got that researching skills class at the very, very worst time. Outside of that project, I never had to use those research skills because by the next time I had to write a research paper, I had Encarta. Usador said, a positive one is the attitude towards people with dwarfism. When I was a kid, and up until my teens, there was no question, we were just seen as a complete joke. The go-to points of reference of us at the time were Mini-Me, Oompa Loompas and Munchkins. I got bullied and mocked constantly. And the notion of me having a relationship or any kind of romantic life? Forget it, unless it's for the punchline for a joke. I felt extremely depressed and hopeless when I was a kid, when I started to fully realize how all this really dehumanizing treatment I would get would be a staple in my entire life. Fast forward to now and I feel like things have taken a shift, for the better. Mostly thanks to representations like Tyrion Lannister from GOT. I can't overstate how much of an impact that has had on my life, just from how different people now think about us and talk about us. I feel like I'm seen as more human now. There's still a long way to go and I still deal with a lot of shit, but I never thought things would actually change this much in my lifetime. Usador said, yeah, it's a great line. Though I kinda love the nuance in the books where Tyrion is clearly not able to follow it himself. On the surface, and in the show, he appears to, by beating people to the punch and disarming them and owning his difference. But in the books, you get an insight into his inner monologue and he is constantly berating himself and insulting himself. Always referring to himself disparagingly in ways like stupid dwarf and stuff like that. It's all well and good being able to stop others from harming you, but you can be so full of self-hate that you're the main perpetrator of that harm. I personally related very strongly to that with my own experience in coming to terms with my dwarfism. I'm in a much better place now, but there was a point when I was able to deflect everyone else's thoughts, but not my own. Tyrion's chapters brought me to tears more than once with how shockingly close his mental state reflected my own when I was in a very bad place in my life. Smart Alec 105 said, it is very fun to see confident characters be hypocrites. In the Stormlight Archive series, there's a character who is kind of like the modern independent woman archetype. She is a middle-aged princess that doesn't want to marry and rejects the church in a very conservative setting. At one point we see a snippet of a treatise she wrote where she wants people to stop putting her in a box. But later on, we see her thinking about how her cousin will be so much happier if he would just decide whether he wanted to be a warrior or a scholar. But I want to say as a disclaimer that she's not super troppish. The author is very good at that, but a brief summary to give the idea won't be able to convey that nuance. Glitterlock said, I was talking to someone about the show Pose recently and how much it impacted the way I think, just by exposing me to things I'm not usually exposed to. To be clear, I've never had any issue whatsoever with LGBTQ+ people, at least as far back as I have any memory of having an opinion, but I also simply haven't known many out people of trans experience. I'm a bit of a loner and my monkey sphere is very small and slow to grow. And so for the first few episodes, that aspect of the show is my focus. This show includes trans people and trans people's stories. That was the dominating thing about the show in my mind, because it was something outside of my typical day-to-day experience. But then over time, as the show continued and the characters were built out more and more, it became this is Blanca's story or this is Angel's story or this is Candy's story. The fact that they were trans people stopped mattering on its own. It only mattered in the way that it affected the stories of the characters. The representation of trans women of color in that show has had such a positive impact on me and helped move me forward in my progress as a human being by giving me the time and exposure needed for me to essentially get over it, to acknowledge and respect the trans experience without letting it dominate the way I view another person. I don't know how it might have impacted trans people, but I hope that it's had a positive effect for them too. Chateau Mojo said, everybody used to smoke. In elevators, in classrooms, in the library, in restaurants, on airplanes, and just pretty much anywhere. Everybody used to drink a lot more than they do now. Alcohol was an important social lubricant until about maybe 1980. The tacit social dress code was much stricter and rigid. Hemlines might go up or down, but everybody had to conform to that. When mini skirts were in fashion, you didn't dare drop anything, because you would have to show everybody your chonies when you picked it up. And girls had to wear either a dress or skirt. Nowadays there is great freedom to choose what you wear. Short dress, long dress, slacks, jeans, shorts, leggings, and about anything you want. I would have been sent home from school for wearing pants. And boy did your knees get cold in the winter. Grown-ups wore hats. Gloves were part of the feminine outfit when you got all dressed up. I remember wearing them with my Girl Scout uniform and formal Scout occasions. There used to be lots of nuns. Mass was in Latin. Old and confused said, "You must be near my age, mid-60s. Everything you describe rings true to my experience. I grew up Methodist, so drinking was highly frowned on, so that was a little different than you. We stayed outdoors playing as a kid. My dad could whistle real loud, and when he whistled we had to get our butts home. Gave us a good 1-block radius to play in. You had better behave when you were out playing, because the parents' network would have reported to your mom and dad any bad behavior before you could get home from, for example, committing the horrible sin of screaming a profanity. And bugs, there used to be so many. The June bugs, we would tether to a thread and fly around the yard, until their leg came off. Hundreds of bees in the clover, we learned to be careful when running barefoot. So many differences. Some good, some not so good. Hopefully our kids can be better stewards of the earth and get climate change under control. I have worries for my grandkids." Anthony 83 said, "It's funny, I can point to exactly when the internet turned sour. As soon as Facebook went public and people started migrating there from MySpace, the internet got too big for its britches and became the toxic thing that it is today. Smartphones exacerbated this trend, but before Facebook, the internet was largely a collection of hobbyists sharing with each other, with little expectation that it would get them anything. MySpace was social media by definition, but the vibe was very different. It was, as I feel, the intended purpose of it. To interact with people that you actually know. It wasn't about shouting political shit into a crowded room of strangers, it was about showing baby pictures to your friends and family. And you know, making people listen to your awful autoplay music while you're there. Now it's all monetized, the same 3 sites full of people screaming at each other. I would sacrifice all the good to go back to the age of web rings and no search engines." Spasenapu said, "Social media, and that includes early Facebook, was an extension of our regular lives. As a shy person with not many friends, it was cool that I could be in contact with my classmates after school in a non-creepy way. I personally knew everyone that I interacted on social media. There was very little politics there, and mostly it was just a bunch of friends sharing what was going on with their lives. You could interact with strangers, but there was very little reason to do so. You might say cute dog on someone's picture, for example. I don't remember when exactly it changed into the cesspool it is today, but it was definitely a planned change in their business model and how they changed their algorithms. Now it's the very opposite of what it used to be. A bunch of mad people yelling at strangers are trying to recruit what little friends they have to join their cause. And sadly that's exactly what Facebook and others wanted, because their data shows that making people mad is the best way to get them to interact and spend time on their site." Digital N said, "The problem is that social media is an inversion of how social interaction is supposed to work. It works without consequence. Consequence is an absolutely fundamental and essential part of human interaction. Social shunning is an essential part as well. And, being able to see others turning their back is also key. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. If you go to the store to buy something, and the guy in front of you in line is ranting about how the government is putting radios in his teeth to limit his superpowers, what is your reaction as a normal goddamn human? Because what I would do is look up the other people in line, share a chuckle with them. This portion is important because it reaffirms you're not crazy, and that other people aren't buying into this nonsense. And then you finish up your business as quickly as possible and move away without talking to them. Now imagine the same thing on the internet." Digital N said, "Somebody says something stupid, and you don't respond to them. Nobody sees that you didn't respond. Nobody sees the other 100 people that didn't respond because it was too stupid of a comment. It just sits there. Then one of two things happens. Either somebody takes the bait and sits down with them as an equal, giving them an equal platform where both opinions are equally valid. Or another truth radio nutbag finds a home with a like-minded crazy person, and they go out to recruit more crazy people, finding like-minded crazy people and concentrating is a large part of the destructive power of social media. The removal of consequence. The removal of sane people recognizing each other in the room, not interacting with the crazy people. Look at the results of this though. As long as you can get attention, you can stay in public focus. People say absurd shit just to be offensive, and then inevitably they're going to get a discussion going with them as the center of it. So all conversations end up being between lunatics and people who enjoy arguing with lunatics. All of the reasonable folks have shaken their heads and walked away without posting. Digital N said, take that environment, and grow a generation up with it as normal. With that being the world they see. I can't imagine growing up now with this perception that the entire world is at war with itself, because every voice that speaks has to be hatefully screaming at another voice or else it won't exist. Rampant depression should not be a feature of a generation. They deserve better than this. Bottom line is this, social media would have been a great thing if not for horrible people being untethered from consequence. And there is still good social media communities out there. Heavily moderated social media in smaller communities that still function like normal human interaction. But any area with a lack of consequence will degrade into a cesspit. Because the worst people are the ones who enjoy the way it is, whether or not they would admit it to themselves. Boiler 7220 said, looking back now, it definitely is regional. When I lived in the upper Midwest for a while, addressing anyone as mom or sir was done by a lot of people. Even if I could tell they were roughly my age, I'd still address them as such, but I'd give it a little kick like yes mom, sort of like I am not saying you were older than me, but I'm saying it as a term of respect. What really got to me though is when I got my first job in my mid-teens. Coming from a culture that uses these titles as a term of endearment respect, I was confused as hell the first few days working. It was odd addressing a coworker 40-50 years my senior by their first names. At first I started saying I'm Army's XXX when no one else was. Luckily I had a coworker from a similar cultural background and I brought it up with him, saying it was odd for me to address by his first name. He laughed and said you got what I meant, but in the professional world, we set traditions aside and switched to professional etiquette. Was a shocker at first but quickly got used to it. Back to Box said, the pristine mountain lake where we used to go swimming and fishing has been ruined by development and pollution. Pines and other trees that once surrounded the lake have been eliminated and oversized houses built in their place. As I once described on AskReddit, the formerly pure lake water has been contaminated due to development and toxic gas oil spills and discharge from motorboat engines. The fish are gone, and the previously peaceful atmosphere is now dominated by the roar of outboard engines. Slipsiniak 3 said, we were talking about this the other day. I live in Northeast NC and when I was a kid, 90s, we would panic if the temp got up to 100 F. Now it's a regular occurrence. The opposite is also true. I work swing shift and one night about 3 years ago, it got down to -10 F. That was not the wind chill, that was the actual temp. The way the weather swings to the extremes now is ridiculous. We would only see snow accumulation once every 2-3 years, now it's several times a year. I know most areas will look at these temps and scoff, but 100+ F and 90+ humidity will mess you up. And the -10 F, I was not prepared for this, as most of the time the low is around 20 F. I did not have the proper clothes to be outside working in that. Saywalt 1206 said, no computers, no internet, no cell phones, men were not allowed to wear hats indoors, elders were addressed as Mr., Mrs. or Miss, or Sir Mom, and first names were never allowed because it was disrespectful, nothing was open on Sunday except for churches, it was family day and always revolved around a huge dinner, women weren't allowed to wear pants to work, gaining a divorce was taboo and scandalous and looked down upon, you were supposed to stick it out no matter what, the ability to have one parent work, dad of course, while mom stayed home to take care of the house and kids and you could survive on that one paycheck, Women were not allowed to work when they became pregnant unless they didn't tell anybody they were pregnant, and it were able to hide the baby bump. Saywalt 1206 said, black kids were forced to sit at the back of the bus and could not use the same water fountains as white kids. They were also forced to sit at the back of the classrooms. You had to share a party line phone. You had a police officer that walks the beat in your neighborhood. It was rare to lock the doors to your home because crime wasn't an issue. I was beaten with a ruler in the first grade by my teacher because I was left-handed, thus stupid, and this was not considered child abuse. No advanced meteorology, you didn't know what the weather was going to be until it actually happened. Sex was never publicly discussed. Married couples on TV always slept in separate twin beds. Pata said, really depends on the parents and how they raise the kids. My kids get very limited screen time and are fine without screens. My 6-year-old spends most days outside from the time she wakes up until she goes to bed with friends riding bikes, making games up and just being a kid. She comes to eat and that's it. We do have a very safe neighborhood. Luckily I know many aren't as lucky, plus tons of kids on the street. I personally grew up in the 90s with zero limits on screens. He watched TV all day and played my Sega non-stop, plus we got AOL when I was 7, so I used it a lot too, and I have a really hard time entertaining myself without them, so that's why I'm trying to keep my kids off them. Cryptongineer said, the internet and other communications, unquestionably. Electronics generally. When I was a kid, calls to grandma, on the West Coast, we were in Europe, were for Christmas and birthdays only, and were booked in advance, and kept short. If you were unlucky, you got a satellite link with really high latency. Even within the US, you thought hard about whether a call was local or long distance. Your household had one telephone, usually in the entrance hall, wired to the wall. Now I video chat for hours with people in any location without even thinking of the cost, from a powerful mobile computer that fits in my pocket. G.B. Ferguson said, it's weird to think about how TV was back when I was a kid compared to today. Your evenings during the week revolved around shows that you had to watch. There wasn't a good guarantee of when new episodes would be repeated, so if you didn't have a VCR that could record, you had to watch each show as they aired or just live with talking to someone about it the next day. If you had 2 shows you liked that aired at the same time, you'd have to pick one and try to watch the other during the off-season. Specialized channels were starting to pop up, so it was neat getting to see Cartoon Network start up and Saturday morning cartoons fall out of style. There was also less to watch, so it wasn't as easy to just binge an entire weekend away with new content.